The plane will be leaving tomorrow whether I do or not. That's right. That's typically how those airlines work. Say again. And Andrea said she'll be on it whether I am or not. Exactly. Well, very good evening, everyone. If you want to go ahead and open your Bibles to Judges, we are going to finish up the last little bit overview of Judges, and then we'll look at the book of Ruth to wrap up tonight. And then next week, Casey will be teaching, and then the week after that, we'll be starting our summer series on Wednesday nights. And so this will be our last night for this overview. And then when next quarter is available that I have, I'll continue this, and we'll just continue right where we left off, and it'll be 1 Samuel. So we're in Judges chapter 13. Judges chapter 13. This is as far as we got last week when we were here, talking about Samson. We got the famous story of Samson, Judges chapter 13 through 16. This is the last of this list of judges. I don't have any slides tonight. We're having some issues with our projector, but really don't need it whenever it comes to this, because you can just look at the Bible. That's what we're here for. And so in that list of judges that we had, those about 12 to 15, as I've always said, depending on how you count them, but 12 to 15 judges. Samson is the last one that we have stories of until we get over to 1 Samuel. And then we get into Eli and Samuel. But there's still several chapters left in the book of Judges, and so we're going to cover those right now, including this one of Samson. So in chapter 13, the first thing that we notice is a miraculous event that is very similar to other miraculous events that we've seen and going to see in more stories in the Bible. So in chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, again, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. You need to realize that this is that cycle going, when he says again, remember that cycle that we had where the children of Israel be disobedient, and then they would be oppressed, and then they would cry out. God would raise up a deliverer. They would be delivered. There'd be peace, and then we'd start all over again. And that's where we're at. But then, when you get down to the next verse, now there was a certain man from Zorah, the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, indeed now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. The reason I say this is something that we see over, it's an event that we see that happens several times throughout the Bible. Who was one of the first ones we saw this happen to? Say again? Abraham. Well, actually it was Sarah, but I know what you meant. I'm right there with you, Abraham. So Abraham and Sarah, then we have it here. Can anybody remember another one that comes up real soon in 1 Samuel? Hannah, there you go. Hannah, and then from there, there's others. And so this is something we see several. So they have a son, and the son is going to be Samson. Look in verse 5. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. So this time, God is raising up a deliverer, a judge, from birth. Right? In the past, we've seen him select different people to be that judge, that deliverer. This time is one coming from birth, and he's going to be a Nazarite. Do you remember us talking about Nazarite, the Nazarite vow, when we were in the book of Leviticus? And so it's a special vow to God. And so this here, and the key element in this, of course, is no razor shall come upon his head, which we all know the story of Samson. So Samson then grows up in this house, and the key thing is in verse 25 here in chapter 13, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Mahana, Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. The main thing is here, the Spirit of the Lord was with Samson. So this is interesting when you see this young man, and here he is going to have this Nazirite vow. He's going to be deliverer for Israel, for the people of Israel, and this vow that we're talking about. However, we also know that Samson had a few weaknesses. Does anybody know what that weakness was that Samson had? Women. Now, he was a strong man. All right, this is one of the things we're going to see over and over. He's a very, very strong man physically, but I don't know how you want to say that mentally. I shouldn't be able to use that term, but in that department, he was very weak, and he had a soft spot for beautiful women. And so the first in chapter 14, he falls in love with a young lady in Timnah. He saw a woman there, and she is a daughter of the, says verse 1, Philistines. Now, is there a problem with that? I see a lot of head shaking. Why is there a problem with her being a daughter of the Philistines? Because what we've read in Deuteronomy chapter 7 in the law, they are not to intermarry. And even in Joshua, when they went in and conquered the lands, again, God repeats that law, you shall not intermarry with the people of the land. Because they're going to bring in their gods, they're going to lead you away from me, says God. All right, so here he falls in love with this young lady, and he decides to marry her, so he is going to have this wedding. And he's going down to the wedding, and he sees a lion come out, and he kills this lion. Remember this part of the story? And so he's going back and forth. He comes back across that lion, still laying on the side of the road, and in that lion was a beehive, and in that beehive was honey, and so he takes some honey out of that. So let me ask you this: he sees this beehive inside this dead lion, and he reaches in there to get that honey. Does that bring up anything from what you remember about the Nazirite vow? Do not touch a dead body. Do not touch it. The Nazirite vow is part of it, is you're not supposed to touch a dead body. So here he is, touching a dead body. So he's already showing, even though we just said that the Spirit of the Lord is with him, his own free will is showing that his will, he is willing to break the laws of God. And so he's marrying somebody who he's not supposed to be marrying, and he's just touched a dead body. And out of that, he comes up with a riddle. So he goes down, and he's hanging out with all of his new buds here at this wedding and the Philistines. And he says, hey, guys, I'm going to give you a riddle. Out of the lion comes something sweet. All right, where is this riddle? What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he says, out of the eater, I read the answer to it instead of the actual riddle. Verse 14, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. What am I? To play the riddler there. And so he stumps him, and he says, tell you what, if you can answer that, I will give you new clothes. If you can answer it, you've got to give me new clothes. And so they come back, and as I mentioned in verse 18, they answer the riddle a few days later. And he realizes the only way they could have known that is because his wife-to-be is the only one who he told the answer to, because she kept asking him about it and everything. Now, there's a pattern here that we're going to see in a minute. So she asked him about it, and he knows that's the only way that they could have known this. And so he gets angry. And so he goes down to the next town, in Ashkelon, and he kills 30 guys down there and takes their clothes and brings it back and gives them to them to pay his end of the bet, or a part of that riddle. And then he goes on about his business. Well, he gets home, and I guess he settles down and decides, well, I guess that wasn't real smart. Maybe I need to think about this. And so he decides to go back. He just leaves his bride at the altar. And so he goes back to get his bride, and he gets there, and they tell him, well, we're sorry, but she's been given to another man. Your best man at the wedding is now her husband. Well, here's another pattern we see with Samson. Samson is what we call a guy who has a short fuse. He blows his top, and this time he goes out and he catches 300 foxes. You remember this part of the story? catches 300 foxes, ties their tails together, sets them on fire, and then lets them go off into the fields and catches all these fields on fire. Now that feat alone, you think about it, 300 foxes. That'd be one thing to catch a dozen or so, but 300? Again, we're seeing the strength of Samson. Burns down these fields and winds up burning down even the house of his, it would have been his bride and her family. Well, that causes some problems now between the political relationships between the Philistines and the Israelites. So the Israelites come to him and say, you've done a bad thing, we need to give you to the Philistines. And he consents and says, well, you can tie me up and take me down there. And, well, once again, it was kind of a trick. He gets down there, they release him to the Philistines, and he breaks loose. And this time he finds, it says in verse 15 of chapter 15, it says he found a fresh jawbone. I love how the Bible is so specific. It doesn't just say some old jawbone. It says a fresh jawbone of a donkey. And reached out his hand and took it and killed, how many does your Bible say? 1,000 men. Listen, I like to practice martial arts for exercise. I do jiu-jitsu. It's wrestling. And I think it's good if I'm able to we wrestle together sometimes. I think it's good if I'm able to do it with like 3 to 4, maybe 5 times. And that's in about a half-hour space with 5 guys. Can you imagine 1,000 men? That's how strong, again, we see Samson. So here he kills 1,000 men with a jawbone. All right, so then Samson goes on about his business. That can't be good enough. So he winds up meeting another girl. All right, we said his weakness are these women. He meets another girl, and this time they're playing games with him and all, and he is going to get caught, and this time he takes the gates of the city. These big gates of a city, and carries them miles away to another town in his rage. And you think this guy would learn his lesson, right? No. Then he falls in love with yet another foreigner. Another foreign. When I say foreigner, I'm talking about outside of the nation of Israel. And I say that because they're not supposed to do that. And this time he falls in love with this girl, and we know her name. Delilah. That's right. So we have famous Delilah. So this time he falls in love with Delilah, and she's already kind of in with the Philistines, and they're trying to learn from her what Samson's secret is. How is it he is so strong and able to do all this? Think of all the damage he has done to the nation. All right, let's try to make this a little bit more real. Let's say we're right here in Florida, okay, and we have this good old Florida boy, and he's a big, strong guy, and he goes up here across the border to Alabama and is dating all these Alabama girls. Don't take this the wrong way. I'm just making an illustration now. But he's dating these Alabama girls, right? And, according to the Florida, this put all this together like with Israelites, he's not supposed to be doing that. Well, he's now burned their crops, right? He's destroyed one of their cities. He's killed 1,000 of those guys. What do you think? How do you think they're going to think about him? He keeps going back to Alabama and dating those Alabama girls. How do you think they're going to feel about him? Come on in, buddy. Is not going to be the answer. So he goes, and this time they're trying to be a little bit more sneaky and figure out what is the deal. Why is he able to do all this? And so you have Delilah coming to him and asking him, so really, what's your secret? And I want you to think about that point of view as well. Here's this big, strong man, but we see this. You remember Popeye? Popeye the Sailor Man. And remember his foe was Brutus. Remember, that's how I kind of see Samson, big Brutus. And who could melt Brutus's heart? Brutus would do anything for one person. Olive oil. And so he would just melt. Even Popeye would just melt. And that's what I see Samson doing. I see Delilah coming in, and batting her eyes and going, Samson, if you really love me, you'll tell me what your secret is. So he's sitting there thinking, well, if you tie me up with certain type of rope, that'll do it. And so they come in, they tie him up, and he wakes up, boom, pops it loose, and says, and then they run out of the room. Let's just do that. And then she comes to him again. And he says, well, okay, this time it's got to be a different type. How many times does she have to come to you and do that, and you wake up the next day and they're there to kill you, that you don't catch on to what's going on? Yet he does it over and over. And not too smart, says Joey. He's not too smart. And then he finally reveals. And it's one of the key things, going back to that Nazirite vow, not cut his hair. And so he falls asleep once again. Here come the Philistines. They cut his hair. This time he jumps up to go to fight them like he has in the past. And this time he's not able to defend himself. This time he's taken prisoner. They gouge out his eyes. And they put him in the threshing floor to start threshing wheat and things like that. And so Samson, because of his weakness, the point being is that his strength came from God being with him. And now, because of this weakness that he had, this sinful weakness, God has left him, and he doesn't have that strength that God had promised him to have. And then we know the rest of the story. Eventually, Samson's hair grows back. He's blind. And one time the Philistines were having a big banquet in a big hall. And they decide that they want to bring, hey, we see this over and over in the Bible too. Hey, let's bring in our trophies. We want to show all you guys, man, we got Samson. You ever heard Samson? Yeah, he ain't so big and tough. We got him. He's our prisoner. Hey, bring in Samson. Yeah, bring him in so we can gaze upon him and laugh at him and stuff. So they bring in Samson. You remember that story? And he tells the young man, he says, put me near these two pillars. He knew exactly which ones it was. And so he takes those pillars and pushes out or pulls them in, whichever, and the entire thing falls down. And the main thing it says is that he kills more in his death than he did the entire time that he was alive. And of course, there's the question of suicide and everything that always comes along in this part. And I won't even go there because that's a different study altogether. But a very interesting story about Samson. And so I don't know when the last time you thought about it or considered it, but we're going to be studying that with our children in our vacation Bible school, the stories of Judges. And so it's important that we understand these stories as well. So that's the last story we have of the Judges. We get to chapter 17, and then we change the style, if you will. See, before, up till this point, it was this cycle, over and over, these different judges. And each story gets a little bit more elaborate, a little bit more information is given. But now we get into some different stories. And the point of this, from chapter 17 to the end, is to tell us how debased, how disobedient, how much disregard there was to God's law. And so over and over, you're going to see this verse. Look in chapter 17, verse 6. You're going to see this phrase. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The book ends with that too, in chapter 21, verse 25. And it's repeated a couple other times throughout the book here, these last few chapters. That's a terrible verse, a terrible thought when you think about it. Everybody does what's right in their own eyes. You think about the Wild West, all right? That's kind of what we are, but worse than the Wild West. Everybody doing whatever's right in their own eyes. So we have a couple of stories here that are quite gruesome and terrible. And the first story that we have right here is in chapter 17, 17 and 18, is about a story of an Ephraimite named Micah. All right, and this shows us, the point of this story is to show us how far Israel had gotten from obeying God. All this class we've been talking about from Genesis all the way up till Joshua conquering that land, all those things that God promised and completed, and now people have gone all the way back to the other end. And so they have this man named Micah, and Micah in Ephraim sets up, he steals some money from his mother, first of all.